Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your questions and go deep. Today, we're diving into a pretty wild topic. Someone wrote in asking about a new fuel formula.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a fuel formula, and it's supposed to be like close to zero emissions.
Really?
Yeah, so we found this expert Q&A online that talks about it, and
Okay.
it has all the usual stuff you'd expect, like gasoline and diesel, but it also has biofuels and e-fuels and even nanotechnology.
Wow, that's
That's pretty wild, right?
it's an interesting mix of like old and new technologies, for sure.
Interesting is one word for it. I think mind-boggling might be closer to the truth.
Yeah.
So can you help break this down for us? The source claims this formula can really cut down on emissions. But before we get lost in all the technical details,
Right.
let's start with the basics.
Sure.
What are the main ingredients in this super clean fuel?
Well, imagine it like a fuel cocktail.
Okay.
The base is 30% low sulfur gasoline and 30% low sulfur diesel. And we're talking about the good stuff here, refined to get rid of all those nasty emissions that cause smog and acid rain.
Low sulfur, so it's like the decaf coffee of fuel.
Yeah, you could say that.
Less intense, but it still does the job.
Right.
I'm full of good analogies today, but what else is in the mix? The source mentioned biofuels.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a whole other topic, isn't it?
It is. So in this formula, we're looking at 21% advanced biofuels.
Okay.
Things like ethanol made from corn stalks or biodiesel from algae.
So like plant-based fuels.
Exactly. The best part about biofuels is that they actually recycle carbon dioxide.
How do they do that?
Well, they absorb CO2 while they're growing and then release it when they're burned. So it's a much more balanced cycle compared to digging up and burning fossil fuels, which just releases more and more CO2 into the atmosphere.
So it's like a carbon roundabout instead of just adding more.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so we have our base fuels, our eco-friendly biofuels, and then there's the really futuristic part, e-fuels.
Yeah, 10% e-fuel to be exact.
E-fuel, it sounds like something straight out of a video game.
Right.
But we're talking about making fuel from captured CO2.
Exactly. It might sound a little crazy.
Yeah, like fighting fire with fire.
In a way, yes. The process is really fascinating, though. They take CO2, which could be from industrial emissions or even directly from the air.
Wow.
And combine it with green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced using renewable energy sources. And what you get is a synthetic fuel that's basically carbon neutral.
Hold on, so we're taking pollution, the stuff that's causing climate change, and turning it back into fuel.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like some kind of environmental magic trick.
Is this even real?
It is. It's a relatively new technology, but the potential is huge.
Okay, so we've got our base fuels, the biofuels, and the sci-fi e-fuels. What else is in this magic potion?
Yes. The source also mentioned some additives.
Additives. Are we talking about fuel system vitamins here?
You could think of it that way.
Okay.
Even though they make up a small percentage of the formula, they're actually really important. So there's one additive that helps reduce those harmful particulate emissions.
You mean those tiny particles that pollute the air?
Yes, exactly. So it's kind of like an air freshener for the whole planet.
I like the sound of that. Cleaner air for everyone.
Exactly. Then we have an additive that helps the diesel portion of the fuel burn more efficiently.
Does that mean like smoother, quieter rides and less of that diesel smell?
You got it.
Okay, I'm sold.
Anything else?
Let me see. Oh, yes, there's also an anti-corrosion and stability additive. It's like giving your fuel system a spa day, keeping things clean and running smoothly. That's a great way to put it. So is that it?
Not quite. This is where we get to the really futuristic part of the formula. It includes 6% cerium oxide nanoparticles.
Nanoparticles, now we're talking. Are we going to give my car superpowers?
Not quite superpowers, but they act as catalysts to make the combustion process more efficient.
Okay.
Which means you get less of those harmful emissions like carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons.
So they're like tiny combustion coaches making sure every molecule is doing its job.
Exactly.
That's pretty impressive. But let's be realistic for a second. Near zero emission sounds fantastic. But can this formula really live up to the hype?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer is it depends.
On what?
Well, remember the e-fuels we talked about?
Yeah.
To be truly near zero, the CO2 used to make them has to come from renewable sources or captured emissions.
Oh, I see.
If it comes from burning fossil fuels, then we're not really solving the problem. We're just shifting it around.
Right. You can't just grab any old CO2 and call it a day.
Exactly. It has to be clean CO2.
So what are the challenges with getting that clean CO2?
Well, capturing CO2 directly from the air is still a pretty expensive and energy-intensive process. And capturing it from industrial emissions requires a whole lot of infrastructure that we just don't have yet.
Okay, so it's not as easy as it sounds?
Not quite. Then there's also the question of storage. Ideally, you want to store that captured CO2 safely and permanently, which means burying it deep underground.
Burying carbon. Are we taking inspiration from squirrels now?
Haha. Well, it's called carbon capture and storage, or CCS for short, and it's definitely a promising solution.
Okay.
But it's still in its early stages. There are concerns about potential leaks, environmental impacts, and whether the public will accept it.
That makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like trusting a bank with your money.
Exactly.
You need to be sure they're not going to lose it. Okay, so we've got our work cut out for us when it comes to renewable energy and CCS. But let's talk about the big elephant in the room, money.
Uh-oh.
We touched on this earlier, but e-fuels and advanced biofuels aren't exactly cheap to produce, are they?
No, they're not. The technologies are still relatively new, and the cost of production is high.
Right.
There's also the issue of the raw materials, biomass for biotools, and renewable energy for e-fuels. Those can be expensive too, depending on where you are in the world.
I see.
And then, of course, CCS adds another layer of cost to the whole thing.
So it's a pretty expensive endeavor all around. It's like trying to buy a Tesla on a bike messenger's salary.
Yeah, kind of. But there is hope for bringing those costs down in the future.
Really? How so?
Well, as with any new technology, the costs tend to go down as production increases and processes become more efficient.
Okay.
We've seen that happen with things like solar panels and electric vehicles.
Right.
So there's no reason to think it can't happen with e-fuels and advanced biofuels as well.
So it's a waiting game, but a hopeful one. I like it. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the human side of all this.
Sure.
We've been discussing the technical and economic challenges, but what about the social factors? How do you think people will react to this new fuel?
That's a really important question. Public perception is key. People need to understand the benefits of this new fuel, how it works, and why it's important for the environment.
Yeah, we need to get people excited about it.
Exactly. We also need to address their concerns about things like safety cost and accessibility.
Right, because at the end of the day, people want to know what's in it for them.
Exactly. They want to know if it's going to save them money at the pump, make their cars run better, and if it's really going to help the planet.
It's like any new product, you need a good marketing campaign to get people on board.
Well, maybe not a full-blown marketing campaign.
Okay.
But we definitely need a clear and compelling message about the benefits.
I agree. But what about the car companies? They're the ones who build the vehicle, so they must have a big stake in all this.
Oh, absolutely.
Would our cars need to be redesigned to run on this new fuel, or is it something we could just start using right away?
That's a great question, and one of the main goals in developing this formula was to make sure it's compatible with existing engines.
Oh, so that's good.
Yeah, the idea is to create a drop-in replacement for regular gasoline and diesel, so people wouldn't need to go out and buy new cars or make big changes to their current ones.
That makes sense. So no need to trade in your gas guzzler for some fancy new e-fuel-powered car.
Exactly.
That's good news for consumers and probably for the car companies, too, because they don't have to completely redesign their cars.
Right.
So the cars themselves don't need a major overhaul. But what about the environmental impact of making and transporting this new fuel? Is it really cleaner from start to finish, or are we just moving the pollution from the tailpipe to the factory?
That's an important point, and it brings us to the idea of life cycle analysis.
Life cycle analysis.
Yeah, to really figure out the environmental impact of any fuel we need to look at its whole life cycle.
Okay.
From where the raw materials come from to how it's produced, transported, used, and eventually disposed of.
So we're talking about the big picture from the oil well to the junkyard.
Exactly. And life cycle analyses of e-fuels and advanced biofuels have actually shown that they have much lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to regular gasoline and diesel.
Really?
Even when you consider the energy used to make and transport them.
Wow. So we're not just swapping one environmental problem for another.
Exactly. But let's be realistic for a second. There are always trade-offs with new technologies.
Of course.
Are there any potential downsides or risks with this fuel that we should be aware of? Well, of course, it's important to be cautious with any new technology and think about both the good and the bad.
Right.
One thing to consider with biofuels is how they might affect land use and food security.
Oh, yeah. That's a good point.
We need to make sure that biofuels are sourced sustainably without destroying forests or taking land away from food crops.
Right. We don't want to solve the climate crisis only to create a global food shortage.
Exactly. We need to find a balance. Another thing to think about is how much energy it takes to make e-fuels. Remember, we need a lot of renewable energy for that process.
Right.
So we have to be mindful of the environmental impacts of building and running those renewable energy facilities.
It's a good reminder that even clean energy can have some impact on the environment.
Definitely. But overall, it seems like this new fuel has the potential to really cut down on transportation's impact on the environment.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me, too. So it's a step in the right direction.
Absolutely. But it's not a perfect solution.
Okay.
We need to do more than just use cleaner fuels.
Like what?
Well, we need to improve vehicle technology.
Okay.
And shift towards more sustainable ways of getting around, like public transit, biking, and walking. And we also need to change our own behavior.
So it's not just about changing the fuel, it's about changing the whole system.
Exactly. We need to work together, governments, industry, researchers, and individuals, to create a future where transportation is both efficient and sustainable.
And on that note, I think we need to take a quick break. But don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to wrap up our deep dive into this fuel-tastic future.
So before we went to break, we were talking about this fuel of the future and all of its amazing potential.
Yeah, we uncovered some pretty amazing stuff.
Definitely.
I mean, who knew fuel could be so complicated? We've got low-sulfur fuels, biofuels, e-fuels, nanoparticles. It's like a chemistry set exploded in a gas tank.
Well, let's hope it's a controlled explosion.
Yeah, fingers crossed. But let's not get too carried away just yet. We talked about needing a lot of renewable energy to make these e-fuels a reality, and it's not as simple as just plugging in a CO2 converter, is it?
Not quite. Remember, the e-fuels need green hydrogen. And to make green hydrogen through electrolysis, you need a lot of clean energy.
Okay.
We're talking about seriously boosting our solar, wind, and hydropower generation.
So basically, we need a renewable energy revolution just to fuel our cars.
Pretty much. And it's not even just about producing more renewable energy.
Oh,
we also need to get that energy where it needs to go. So we need a super efficient energy grid that can handle that increased demand.
A grid that can handle all those electrons zooming around, powering our e-fuel factories. I get it. But even if we figure out the whole renewable energy thing, what about the CO2 capture and storage? We can't just sweep all that carbon dioxide under the rug, can we?
No, not really. That's where CCS comes in.
CCS.
Carbon capture and storage. The idea is to capture the CO2 either from industrial emissions or straight from the air.
Okay.
And then inject it deep underground into special geological formations where it can be stored safely for hundreds of years.
We're basically turning the Earth into a giant carbon vault. Sounds like something out of a superhero movie, but are we sure those vaults won't spring a leak?
That's one of the big concerns with CCS. The technology is still being developed, and there are worries about potential leaks, the impact on the environment, and what people will think about it.
Yeah, not everyone is going to be comfortable with storing tons of CO2 underground, even if it's supposed to be safe.
You're right. It's like trusting a bank with your money.
Exactly. You have to be sure they're not going to lose it. Okay, so we've got renewable energy and CCS to figure out. But let's be honest, money talks, we talked about this before, but e-fuels and advanced biofuels are expensive to make right.
Yeah, they are. The technologies are still fairly new and production costs are high.
I see.
And then there's the cost of getting the raw materials, the biomass for biofuels, and the renewable energy for e-fuels. Those can be pricey too, depending on where you are in the world.
I get it.
And then don't forget CCS, that adds another layer of cost on top of everything else.
So it's a pretty expensive endeavor. It's like trying to buy a Tesla on a minimum wage salary.
Yeah, you could say that. But there is hope that the costs will come down eventually.
You think so? How?
Well, as with any new technology, the costs usually decrease as production scales up and things become more efficient.
That makes sense.
It happened with solar panels and electric vehicles.
Right.
So there's no reason why it can't happen with e-fuels and advanced biofuels too.
So it's a waiting game, but a hopeful one. I like that. But let's switch gears for a bit and talk about the people involved in all of this.
Okay.
We've been talking about the technical stuff and the economics. But what about the social aspects? How do you think people will feel about this new fuel?
That's a great question. Public perception is super important. People need to understand what this fuel can do, how it works, and why it's good for the environment.
Yeah, we need to get people excited about it.
Right. We also need to address any concerns they might have about things like safety cost and access.
I agree. Because at the end of the day, people want to know how this affects them personally.
Exactly. Will it save them money at the gas station? Will it make their cars run smoother? And will it really make a difference for the planet?
It's like with any new product, you need a killer marketing campaign to get people on board.
Maybe not a full-blown marketing campaign.
Okay.
But we definitely need to get the message out there and make sure people understand the benefits.
I hear you. But what about the car companies? They're the ones building the cars, so they must have a big interest in this.
Absolutely.
Would our cars need a complete redesign to use this new fuel, or can we just start using it as is?
That's a great question. And one of the main things we focused on when developing this formula was to make sure it works with the engines we already have.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, the goal is to create a fuel that can directly replace regular gasoline and diesel.
Okay.
So people wouldn't have to buy brand new cars or make major changes to their current vehicles.
That makes sense. So no need to ditch your old gas guzzler for some fancy new e-fuel powered car.
Not at all.
That's good news for consumers and probably for the car companies, too. They won't have to completely retool their factories.
Exactly. There might be some minor adjustments needed to get the most out of the engine and the emission control systems. But overall, the transition should be pretty smooth from a manufacturing perspective.
So the cars are good to go. But what about the environmental impact of producing and transporting this new fuel? Is it really cleaner from beginning to end, or are we just moving the pollutions from the tailpipe to the factory?
That's an important consideration, and it brings us to the idea of life cycle analysis.
Life cycle analysis.
Yeah, to get a true understanding of any fuel's environmental impact, we need to look at its entire life cycle.
Okay.
From extracting the raw materials to production, transportation use, and finally disposal.
So it's about looking at the big picture. from the oil well to the junkyard.
You got it. And when you do a life cycle analysis of e-fuels and advanced biofuels, they actually have much lower greenhouse gas emissions than regular gasoline and diesel. Yes, even when you factor in the energy needed to make and transport them.
So we're not just trading one environmental problem for another.
Exactly. But let's be realistic for a moment. There are always trade-offs when it comes to new technologies.
True.
So are there any potential downsides or risks associated with this fuel that we should be thinking about? Of course, it's always smart to be cautious with new technology and consider both the good and the bad. One thing to consider with biofuels is how they might affect land use and our food supply.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
We need to make sure biofuels are produced sustainably without destroying forests or using land that's needed to grow food.
Yeah, we don't want to solve the climate crisis only to end up with a global food shortage.
Exactly. That would be a disaster. Another thing to think about is how much energy is needed to make e-fuels.
Right.
We need a lot of renewable energy for that, so we have to be aware of the environmental impact of building and running those renewable energy facilities.
It's a good reminder that even clean energy can have an impact on the environment.
Definitely. But when you look at the big picture, it seems like this new fuel has the potential to significantly reduce the impact of transportation on the environment.
I think so too. It's a step towards a cleaner future.
For sure. But it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
What else needs to happen?
Well, we need to continue improving vehicle technology.
Okay.
And we need to move towards more sustainable ways of getting around, like public transport, biking, and walking.
Uh-huh.
And of course, we all need to change our own behavior, too.
So it's not just about changing the fuel, it's about changing the entire system.
Exactly. It's a team effort. We need governments, industry researchers, and individuals all working together to create a future where transportation is both efficient and environmentally friendly.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up this epic fuel-powered adventure.
Yeah.
We've talked about the science, the economics, and even how people might react to this new fuel. But now I want to step back and look at the bigger picture. We've been talking about this incredible new fuel formula, low sulfur fuels, biofuels, e-fuels, nanoparticles. It's like the dream team of fuel technologies coming together to save the planet from those nasty emissions.
It's pretty impressive.
It is, but is it enough?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this fuel seems like a game changer, but it's only one part of the solution, right?
Right. It's a powerful tool, but it's not a magic bullet.
Okay, so no silver bullet that's going to solve all our transportation problems.
I wish it were that easy. Unfortunately, we can't just fill up our cars with this new fuel and expect everything to be perfect.
Right.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
How?
We need to think bigger. We need a more holistic approach.
Okay, I'm listening. What does this holistic approach look like?
Well, it starts with rethinking how we use our cars.
Oh, I knew this was coming.
For decades, we've designed our cities and our lives around having our own personal vehicles.
Yeah.
But as the population grows and climate change gets worse, that model just isn't sustainable anymore.
So you're saying we need to break up with our cars?
It's not necessarily about breaking up completely, but maybe we need to start seeing other modes of transportation.
Like what?
Think public transportation, biking, walking, ride sharing. These options can really help us rely less on our personal cars.
Yeah, and make our cities more livable.
Exactly.
Because even the cleanest car still takes up space on the road and adds to traffic. It's like trying to fit everyone into a phone booth. It's just not going to work.
Right. We need transportation systems that are more efficient, fair, and accessible to everyone.
I agree. So less solo commuting and gaff guzzlers and more shared rides, bikes, and just plain old walking.
Exactly.
Got it. But what about us regular folks? What can we do? Is this just something for governments and big companies to figure out, or can everyday people make a difference?
Individual actions definitely matter. Every choice we make, from what kind of car we buy to how often we drive, makes a difference.
That's empowering.
Yeah. By choosing fuel-efficient vehicles, using public transit whenever possible, and walking or biking more, we can all contribute to a more sustainable transportation system.
So it's about being more aware of our choices and making decisions that align with what we believe in.
Exactly. It's about understanding that transportation is more than just getting from point A to point B.
I like that.
It's about connecting with our communities, taking care of our environment, and creating a future where everyone has access to transportation.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the future of fuel. It's been a wild ride full of twists and turns and maybe even a few existential questions along the way.
It has.
But that's what we do here on the Deep Dive. We explore the complicated, the controversial, and the mind-blowing. And hopefully we leave you with more questions than answers.
Because curiosity is what drives us forward.
And on that note, folks, we're signing off. Thanks for tuning in and keep those brains buzzing.